Good day, everyone. Welcome to the DSTL Arts Community Bridges Workshop Series. My name is Mauricio Moreno, and the topic today that we're going to be discussing is the United Farm Workers Movement. The title is We Can Be Heroes. And we're going to be talking not just about the farm workers movement, but also folklore poetry and how we can use elements of this poetic type in order to write about our own history and our own legends and to create our own mythos and make ourselves and our own heroes part of the narrative. We're going to be going over some of the key activists of the farm workers movement. We're also going to be discussing the major events. This will be a brief history. We're just going to the main beats of the movement and some of the impacts that they had immediately after the strike and today, later on. And we'll also be discussing some poetic techniques that we can use to create poetry and folklore poetry. And I'll have some prompts for you towards the end. So we're first going to talk about Cesar Chavez. The image behind me was taken of him during his last days on his one of his hunger strikes with Bobby Kennedy to his right. And just a brief overview of who he was. Cesar Chavez was a civil rights activist and leader of the NFWA. He was born in Yuma, Arizona. He traveled to California with his family in order to search for work, like many Americans in the Midwest did throughout the 30s because of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. So he was one of many migrant workers that would search for work. And he had a very rough life. He had to quit high school. He never finished high school because his father had injured himself on the job and he found himself working the fields from an early age. He moved around a lot with his family. I think he attended something like 30 high schools because of that constant movement. So he had a firsthand view of the abysmal conditions of the farm workers. Him and his family will often be cramped in a room with sleeping on hay, or other migrant families like maybe 10, 12 to a small room. So he would see firsthand some of the conditions that he would eventually fight for. From the very young age, he had this fire that was born in him for justice, to demand respect and rights to the farm workers who, weren't paid much. At the time, they were paid much less than the minimum wage because there was no any official law that prohibited the growers from paying them any less than minimum wage. So the workers might get paid 30 cents, which at the time might have been $3 to $4 a day. And that was even before they deducted, say, room and board from the migrant workers, using a room or even like a space in the barn to sleep, deducting money from meals. It almost amounted to indentured servitude, to a point where they were very reliant on the growers. And it's almost like they formed like this very twisted like bond of like, well, the growers kind of saw the migrant workers as, oh, they're happy because they're getting all this work. So it was very twisted where the growers kind of controlled the narrative and said, well, my pickers are happy, because I treat them well. A very like paternalistic relationship that, when Cesar Chavez actually went and spoke to the workers, was extremely false. The workers were not being respected, and many of them did eventually join the cause. Going back to Cesar Chavez, he was actually recruited by Fred Ross, who was head of the CSO, the Community Service Organization, and he was responsible for holding rallies for voting rights, fighting against discrimination, economic discrimination, and he did so for about 10 years. He eventually met Dolores Huerta, who we will speak about later. About 3 years working with the CSO. Through this interaction and this partnership, they actually branched out from the CSO in 10 years and joined forces, Dolores and Cesar, in 1962 to create the National Farm Workers Association, mostly because the CSO was just being very reticent about establishing a firm standing to support farm workers. They were trying not to be part of the problem, or not try to be, like a just kind of like a non-biased, like, we don't want to be part of that argument. Those values disaligned from Caesar, and Dolores agreed, so they started the National Farm Workers Association in 1962. And this is important because this was one of the first steps that would eventually lead to United Farm Workers California, which we'll talk about in more detail. But this was the beginning, and Cesar Chavez was one of the driving forces. I'm going to be listing some notable characteristics of our key figures. We're going to be using this for an exercise a little later. Just some notable characteristics about Cesar Chavez. Although he was a leader, he was very soft spoken. He was often embarrassed on stage. He was very humble. He usually spoke very soft spoken. He still commanded a room, but he was very much one to listen. I mean, he was still a leader of an organization, so he had those skills. But throughout his life, he was still known for his soft spoken, very gentle nature. He also, short stature. He was a short guy, but he still commanded a room as well. Something interesting about him as well, he often arrived late to functions by an hour, 2 hours, and he was infamous for that because en route to these destinations, to these conferences, to these meetings, he would stop at a local farm and actually speak with the farm workers, very grassroots efforts, like just to talk to them and listen to them and actually get their point of view in the picture. And I think it was this grassroots effort that really, emboldened many of the workers and kind of, they supported him because of this one-on-one interaction with the workers. Cesar Chavez practiced nonviolence. He quoted many times that his inspirations were Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. MLK Jr., who they never met in person, but Cesar Chavez did correspond with MLK. It was this interaction that actually inspired him later on. Many of the actions that he took to protest nonviolently involved hunger strikes and a march, which we'll talk about later. That's very rough overview of Cesar Chavez. We're going to go and move on to Dolores Huerta. Now, Dolores Huerta, as you see in the image behind me, she was born in April 10, 1930. She still is alive. She continues to be a part of the UFW, and she still continues and goes to rallies. She's still very much a driving force in the farm workers movement. She co-founded with Cesar Chavez, as I mentioned before, National Farm Workers Association. I believe she also co-founded the CSO, the organization that initially Cesar Chavez began, where her and Caesar met. So this happened around 1952. Like I mentioned, they had met in Oakland at a fundraiser, Dolores and Caesar, in about 1954, I want to say. And it was from there that they had like this friendship that was bonded by this drive to support migrant workers. And it was because of Dolores Huerta who, with Caesar, decided to actually break away from the CSO and start the National Farm Workers Association. Interesting facts about Dolores Huerta: she was the lead negotiator in the workers' contract towards the end of the grape strike in 1970, when the two largest growers, Shenley and DeGiorgio, actually did agree to have a sit down and agree to the terms. She was the one that negotiated the terms. She was the one that was the spokesperson for the workers. She had a very strong, presence in the farm workers movement. And without her, the farm workers movement would not have been as successful as it was. A couple more notable characteristics about her: she actually coined the term "si se puede," that phrase, which, as many of you know, in English was used by President Barack Obama. Yes, we can, but Dolores Huerta was the OG. She coined that term, "si se puede." Also, she continues to be active today. She still goes to rallies. She still has talks. She has speeches. She's very much sought after, and she continues to fight. And she's been doing so for 40 years. She hasn't swayed ever since, even in her old age, which is something to be very proud of and lauded. Going to a little bit to her history, she became a civil rights activist mostly in part with her mother. When she was young, Dolores's mother owned a 70-room hotel. And out of that hotel, her mother would actually house migrant workers, farm workers, low wage workers, and even opened up her rooms at no cost for poorer families. So while Dolores was helping her mother with the duties of the hotel, she would frequently speak with the workers, and she would hear the firsthand stories of them. And she would see, the workers coming home after a long day of work. Their hands were bruised and bleeding. So she had a very visceral knowledge of how poorly the workers were treated and how rough those conditions were. So similar to Cesar Chavez, he was very much on that front line and saw exactly the effects of what disrespecting the workers and the growers, how they treated the migrant workers, what that effect looked like. That's, like I said, a very brief introduction. I could speak much more about her, but for the sake of time, we're just going to cover like the basics. And finally, we're going to talk about someone who is often left out of the story of the farm workers movement, which should not be. This person was possibly one of like the driving factors of why there was a strike, and his influence is definitely should be respected and continued on through history. And his name is Larry Ed Leong. And he was a Filipino American labor organizer. He was born in 1913, so a little bit older than Caesar in terms of being a predecessor. He essentially started the workers in the West. He organized the West Coast agricultural workers. He was known as one of the fathers of West Coast labor movements. In a lot of sense, Larry Ed Leong was kind of like the father of what Cesar Chavez would eventually pick up later. He definitely laid the foundation for many of the achievements that Cesar and Dolores and the whole UFW eventually did. So yeah, he started working in the 1930s with agricultural workers. He actually worked a lot throughout the West Coast. He worked in Washington and in Alaskan Cannery. He organized cannery and agricultural unions in Washington and California. So similarly to Dolores and to Caesar, Larry started his first protest at age 17. So similar to them, he started young. He witnessed some, like most of the atrocities of being a migrant worker and just a worker in general based on the poor conditions that he worked. Notable characteristic about him, they called him Seven Fingers because he did lose three of his fingers at an Alaskan cannery. I think that definitely like fueled his desire to push for more like safety precautions in the workplace. There was, unfortunately, those safety precautions were left out for a lot of migrant workers and immigrant workers, were not enforced. He organized, as I mentioned, a lot of the unions in Washington and California because of Larry Ed Leong. I'm going to mention this a little later, but in 1965, that was when the Delano Great Strike started, and Larry Ed Leong and his organization, the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, or the AWOC, were the first to vote and begin the strike. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more, but he was the first one to actually initiate the strike, which Caesar would later, in solidarity, help out. But Larry Ed Leong was the driving force throughout the grape strike, and it was his collaboration with Cesar Chavez that eventually would lead to the UFW that we know today. A couple more things about him. I posted up his picture. That's him on the right. He was an avid cigar smoker, but he was also similar to Caesar. He didn't finish high school because of his circumstances. He did have to work, when he was younger. But despite that, or maybe because of that, he was very ambitious for himself. He was a polyglot. He spoke Spanish, Cantonese, Japanese, Tagalog. He spoke several Filipino languages. He self-taught himself law. Even without a high school education, he was very sharp. He was very smart, and that was the reason for his following, for so many people joining the AWOC. He knew how to read people as well. And something also interesting about him was compared to Cesar Chavez, Larry Ed Leong was a little bit more militant. If you wanted to compare them to, say, MLK and Malcolm X, before he went to Mecca and kind of had a change of heart, he was very much more action. Not to say he was violent prone, but he was more readily ready for a strike than Caesar, who was a little bit more diplomatic in that sense. But it definitely clashed with Cesar Chavez's nonviolent approach. But between Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and Larry Ed Leong, these were three of the main drivers of the farm workers movement. So we're going to go ahead and talk about the major events. The big one being the Delano Grape Strike. As I mentioned before, it was 1965. Larry Ed Leong and the AWOC had voted yes to strike against the table growers of Delano, California, in Tulare County. And on September 8th, they actually initiated the strike. And what was interesting about the strike was that in the past, the grape growers would often pit the different ethnicities of workers against each other. They would segregate them in the farm. So they have the Filipinos on one end, the Mexicans on the other, the black workers on the other. I mean, it was very much still segregated. And oftentimes, if there was a strike from, say, Filipino workers, the growers would employ Mexican workers to break the strike. So unfortunately, there was a lot of tension and animosity among Filipino and Mexican workers. So that made like this decision so much more impactful because Larry Ed Leong and the AWOC started the strike, and Cesar Chavez, in solidarity, told his workers, do not break the strike. Even though growers were kind of like pushing for them to, like, kind of create a schism among themselves, Cesar Chavez and the NFWA said, we're not going to prevent it. And it was this solidarity that a year later in 1966, Larry Ed Leong with the AWOC and Cesar Chavez with the NFWA combined forces and became what we know today as the UFW, the United Farm Workers of California. And interestingly enough, the AWOC was a part of the AFL-CIO, and that partnership definitely pooled the resources and provided help that they desperately needed. Because at the time, the NFWA had very limited resources, not as much outreach, very strictly, they very much a local organization. They still had like different satellites and different, organizations they partnered with, but it was very difficult to get that word out. One of the ways that that happened to get public attention, a year later in 1966, on March 17th, Cesar Chavez got inspired by MLK's March to Montgomery from Selma. And in a similar fashion, he and several other workers embarked on a 300-mile march from Delano to Sacramento. In the same fashion, they started to spread public attention of La Causa. They would go to different farms and talk to different workers, and the media would come out and interview the workers and the pickers, and they would talk to Cesar Chavez, and eventually that kind of snowballed into the movement that we know of today. And that was in 1966. And from these, thousands of people took up the mantle to boycott the table grapes. And there were many stores on the East Coast that would just refuse shipments at their door. There were definitely stories of people that would throw out thousands of pounds of grapes away. Even in Boston, there was a Boston Tea Party type of event where people that received shipments threw them into the harbor, thousands of pounds, in order to support the boycott. This, in turn, because of that influence, it caused a lot of resistance, especially in Delano. A lot of the citizens of Delano were not for the strike. They kind of saw the UFW antagonistically. At the time, communism was still a really huge red scare. So they would often say, well, the communists, Cesar Chavez is a communist. Unfortunately, that led to violence. That led to a lot of lives lost, a lot of violence against the workers on both sides, unfortunately. But there was, after 4 years of these events, there was finally an agreement. In 1970, the two largest growers, Shanley and DeGiorgio, agreed to the terms, and these were the ones that put up the most resistance. Shanley, not as much as DeGiorgio, because DeGiorgio had, I think, like 2 to 3% of their profit was even from table grape sales. So they kind of saw that as like a drop in the bucket. But because of the bad publicity that they were getting, they finally agreed in 1970. And that all happened because of all these different factors: the strike in 65, the march in 66. Eventually, Cesar Chavez would undergo a hunger strike as well, which caused even more, public outcry. And finally, in 1970, the UFW sat down with Shanley and DeGiorgio, and they came to an agreement. Those negotiations started. And some of those benefits of the boycott were higher pay, 2 weeks paid vacation, more standardized terms in terms of working conditions, like living conditions, having food, like having things like working a toilet. Those things were not guaranteed. Oftentimes, like, workers would have to like defecate into the land without no sort of amenities. So all of those things were covered. A lot of the things we take for granted now have become standard because of those negotiations from early on. So now that we've covered the UFW and the impacts of the Delano Great Boycott, we're going to talk a little bit about the takeaways. Because of the movement, there was actually a push more for this acceptance and pride of being migrant workers and eventually Chicano empowerment. So because of these rallies, there was a Teatro Campesino, which was a theater group that specifically had plays about the farm workers, the movement, the protesters. They would often have plays that are of protest against the growers against the sheriffs, and that definitely did a lot to spread that message throughout the United States. And from that came this pride of being Chicano, and the Chicano movement came out of the farm workers as well. Many people, claim that the Chicano movement came about kind of in tandem with the farm workers movement. And we see that today now. There has been like a lot of growth and we have come a long way in terms of, having more accountability and having more visibility and representation in different fields for Chicanos, Chicano history, Latinx history, Latinos, and Hollywood and the literary scene as authors. We still have a long way to go. No movement is perfect. The Chicano movement had many flaws, as well as the farm workers movement. And I think the point of studying our history is knowing what was done right, knowing what could have done better, and using those, lessons and taking those with us now to better the movement, to continue the movement, to keep pushing for equal rights and representation. Those are some of the takeaways from that series. Now we're going to go into the poetic part of the workshop, and we're going to talk a little bit about folklore poetry. So the question that I pose is, how can we use folklore poetry in relation to UFW and the movement? As I was mentioning, we can use poetry and other forms of writing to pass down tradition. There are many stories of the farm workers that aren't expressed in the media or in the news, that are often lost, if not shared, firsthand accounts, the stories of the farm workers, even the plays that depict these farm workers and the strikers. Those are all forms of passing down tradition of our history. And we can use folklore poetry in order to highlight that and keep that relevant and bring that to the present. And folklore poetry allows us to take these, real people and make them epic. We talk about Greek mythology, and we talk about the different gods of the Greek and Roman pantheons and of their powers. We talk about Aphrodite's beauty, and they're taking maybe these very human elements, and they're making it into a grandiose, quality in order to over exemplify it, to show the impact of it. I think in a deeper sense, we use folklore poetry to remember our values. The stories that we tell usually have allegories in them that show, and highlight what are our values. Are our values, to be respected, hard work, nuclear family. I don't know if that's the right word, but different values, independence, community, like togetherness, like all of those values can be expressed in the stories that we speak, in the allegories and the lessons that we learn from those stories. With that in mind, I'm going to read a poem. It's bilingual, so it is in Spanish and English. So what I'm going to do is I'll read the poem 3 times. The first time I'll read it as the author intended, and then I'll translate it in Spanish and English. The name of the poem is called El Patriarca de mi Pueblo es el Amor. In English, that means the patriarch of my town is love. And it's by a poet named Alurista, who's a Chicano poet and activist. And so this is the original poem. El Patriarca de mi Pueblo es el Amor, anthropomorphic mutant in the flesh, sobre el hueso de marfil dorado, with the rape of life desnuda y ruborizada in the shame. El patriarca de mi pueblo es el amor, el que palpita y brota in the gushing of my flesh, in wounds, para fundir el bronce in golden blood, in love. La mano de mi Dios se extiende, with flowers in its palm, open to descend on my head and warm my flesh con fuego. And in English, the patriarch of my town is love, anthropomorphic mutant in the flesh, over bone and golden ivory, with the rape of life, naked and blushing in shame. The patriarch of my town is love, the one that beats and bruises in the gushing of my flesh in wounds, to bond the bronze and golden blood in love. The hand of God extends with flowers in its palm, open to descend on my head with warm flesh and fire. And here's the poem in Spanish. El patriarca de mi pueblo es el amor, mutante antropomórfico en la piel sobre el hueso de marfil dorado, con la violación de vida, desnuda y ruborizada en la pena. El patriarca de mi pueblo es el amor, el que papita y brota en la efusiva de mi piel, en heridas, para fundir el bronce, en sangre dorada, en amor. La mano de mi Dios se extiende, con flores en la palma, abiertas, para descender sobre mi cabeza y calentar mi piel con fuego. So the reason I chose this poem is because there are certain elements in this poem that are going to reflect what we want to talk about. Mainly, the first one is going to be kennings, and it's a technique that it's a quick and easy way to describe something totally different. In the example that we just read, there is the example of anthropomorphic mutant to talk about love. It's a very specific and fleshy, kenning. And this is what we want to study today, one of the techniques. So, what is a kenning? Kenning is essentially a compound word used to describe something else. It's usually metaphorical in nature. It's been used in Old English and Norse poetry. Beowulf is the biggest example. It's definitely used in the Floricanto, which I will provide more resources at the end of this workshop and let you know how you can, if you want to purchase it. But it's essentially a two-word phrase. It replaces one word noun and it has different purposes. I have here a pen. It's a standard pen. A kenning would use to describe a pen based on its function. So this pen can be a writing stick. It's two words that describe what a pen is. It's its function. So kennings can be used to describe the function of an object. It can also be used to describe a deeper meaning of the pen. There are poets like Pablo Neruda that also employs this tactic of going deeper into an item, like an ode. This pen could also be a world creator. If you take a pen and you write down a story, you can create a world. It goes deep into deeper meanings of what that object is. And you can use this technique for, say, like a job, like a worker, a title, a person. I'm going to give you some examples. So, take, for example, a bookstore. One of those could be an idea haven, a word bank, a book bank, where a place where you can deposit and withdraw books. Legend ledger, place where you keep legends. It's a place to detail where stories are. Poetry, like the Floricanto, flower song. Actually, the Floricanto is a kenning, which means flower song, which is a way to say poetry as well. Grape genuflectors is one I thought of for the grape pickers. But this is one of those examples, some of those examples. With this, we're actually going to go to our first exercise. As you scroll down through the worksheet provided to you, the first example is pretty simple. Practice your own. Wherever you are, whether you're at home or in a coffee shop or wherever you are, look around. What items do you see around you? If you're at a coffee shop, maybe you see a coffee cup, maybe you see someone's bag, maybe you see a light fixture. The smell of coffee could also be a topic. So you're going to like list these objects and you're going to think of different ways to describe these objects. You can focus on their function, you can focus on going a little deeper, or you can just kind of play along with it. There are no wrong answers here. This is just for practice. And this exercise is going to help us later on with some of our prompts. So just take some time to practice this. And you can definitely pause the video here and give yourself time to practice these. Once you finish the practice, we're going to go ahead and go over our next poetic tool in our toolbox, and that's called hyperbole. Hyperbole is essentially exaggeration. It's rhetorical and literary technique. The author or speaker intentionally uses exaggeration and overstatement for emphasis. If you look at the myths like Greek mythology and Roman mythology, the pantheons of gods that they have are essentially using hyperbole to describe their gifts. Aphrodite's beauty was the most beautiful in the world, is a hyperbole. It's taking something like physical beauty and extending it like to be epic, to be the best. And it's used in myths, folklore. It's used in a lot of our superhero, stories. It just takes facts about people and makes them incredible. And I'm here for us to take hold of that and use that same power that is used for superheroes and apply it to ourselves, apply it to you. You may have qualities of yourself that you want to highlight, and that's going to be something that is going to be a great candidate for hyperbole. You may know someone who is a hero to you, whether it's a family member, a friend, someone in your community, someone that you may not know but are a fan of. All of these people are definitely can be used to use, hyperbole as an example. Some of the examples I have are very basic. I'm sure you'll do much better at coming up with these. It's raining cats and dogs. Tale as old as time. They cried rivers into the soil. These are ways to exaggerate something that's happening. The next example is going to be your turn to try it. Going back to the first couple pages of the worksheet, the notable characteristics that I've laid out about Larry Ed Leong, Dolores Huerta, and Cesar Chavez, you can use some of those notable characteristics, find one that you resonate with, and use hyperbole to make them larger than life. Maybe Larry Ed Leong, even though he lost 7 fingers, or lost 3 fingers, my apologies. From those 7 fingers, he gained superpowers where he could point at someone and they do exactly what he says. Or maybe Dolores Huerta has like the gift of voice where her voice can just like silence everyone, kind of like Black Bolt from the Marvelverse. Using like those real life characteristics, you can create hyperbole and epic powers to make them larger than life. And I encourage you to either that, so two options for this exercise. You can use the notable characteristics from Caesar, Dolores, or Larry, or take 5 facts about yourself or someone you know, make them incredible. Maybe you have this special skill and gift, multiply that by 100. What would that look like? Would that be a superpower? Would it be something that helps others? Look into your own life and look into the people in your life to find those characteristics and qualities because chances are they're there. And sometimes we may not even need to look that hard. There are heroes around us everywhere in the smaller actions, of everyday people. I think part of the reason why like Cesar Chavez was such a strong figure was because he was an average person. He didn't have a high school education, and yet he moved so many people just through his dedication, just through talking to people one on one and continuing that struggle. And I encourage you all to find that power within yourselves because it's all there. It's all in all of us. And with that, we're coming close to the end of our workshop. I just want to take this time to say thank you all. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be able to facilitate this workshop. I'm going to leave you with some final prompts that you can use in order to write your own history and write your own mythology. I'm going to give you several options. Feel free to use any one of these. You can definitely use any permutation of them, combine them, write your own. This is really just to get you writing. So the first one is write a poem of Kennings to describe yourself or your hero. And you can use the examples from the Kennings exercise for this. The next prompt would be in the same vein, write a poem about your hero using hyperbole, writing about yourself. And here's where you can use the examples from exercise 2 as well. The third prompt would be write a short poem using hyperbole or Kennings to emulate any figure in the UFW as a deity or hero. What would be some of the characteristics that you would use to with hyperbole to make them the hero? Use the answers from exercise 1 if you did decide to use the UFW figures in order to, their notable characteristics. If not, use someone in your life, yourself, all cards on the table here. And the last prompt, imagine yourself with superpowers. Using everything that we've discussed and learned about, write a short poem about what your powers would be. What is your superpower and how you would use them? The whole reason why we wanted to have this Community Bridges workshop is to connect with our history and to empower ourselves to take that action and be part of the history ourselves so that we can continue that change because no movement is ever perfect. There is no movement that is 100% effective. And there are things that could have been done better. So in that same vein, we can learn from the United Farm Workers movement, any movement for that matter, and we can take those lessons and apply them to today's standards. We can make heroes out of ourselves because we are heroes in our own stories. And I'm sure there are people out there that will see us as heroes the more that we continue on this path to inspire ourselves and inspire others as well. Because at the end of the day, we're all in this together. That's why we wanted this workshop to be about bridging community, to the history, to the present, so we can empower ourselves, be that change and make that brighter future today for all of us. So with that, thank you so much. It's been an honor and a pleasure to facilitate this workshop for you all. I hope that you continue to write. I hope that you continue to learn and to discover our history and use that to fuel our understanding and be open to speaking to others and understanding their histories and eventually making a brighter future for all of us. Thank you all and keep writing.